Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Dwight Eisenhower, and the focus is Supreme Commander, Sicily, Italy, and Kay. The year is 1943. We'll start with Kay. Kay being Kay Summersby, the young woman who had been Ike's driver since he had got to London in charge of all U.S. Army forces in Europe. And she had become basically a constant companion with him morning, noon, evenings, Telegraph Cottage. And now that he's in North Africa fighting the fight there, he actually wanted Kay to join him. And so he arranged for 10 women support staffers to be brought over to North Africa on the RMS Strathallan. The problem was that ship was torpedoed by a German submarine, and as it was going down, Kay and others got into lifeboats. They did make it to safety and did make it to North Africa. A very emotional night for Dwight Eisenhower, who told her that I followed the progress of that convoy as I followed no other convoy, and then the bottom fell out of my world. I spent that night worrying about you, cursing myself for not having had you fly to Algiers. I went through hell that night. Well, there was also a reporter in that lifeboat from Life magazine who was a photojournalist who took pictures of the people in the lifeboat, and they showed up in Life magazine. And Mamie Eisenhower back in the United States saw Kay Summersby, Ike's driver. What is she doing going to North Africa? That's what she asked Eisenhower, who responded in a letter. If anyone is banal and foolish enough to lift an eyebrow at an old duffer such as I am in connection with WACs, Red Cross workers, nurses, and drivers, you will know that I have no emotional involvements and will have none. You are all that any man could ask for as a partner and a sweetheart. This kind of back and forth with Mamie, though, would continue throughout much of the war. Kay wrote a book right after the war called Eisenhower Was My Boss. And in that, there were a lot of pretty cool insights, and she had a first-hand seat for all of the action during World War II in Eisenhower, but there was no hint of an affair in that book. But a couple decades later, 1976, she's dying of cancer. Eisenhower's already dead. Mamie is still alive. She wrote another book called Past Forgetting. And in this one, she talked about the growth of the affair, an affair of the heart between her and Eisenhower. And a lot of it really kicked in after Summersby's fiancé, an American colonel by the name of Richard Arnold, was killed in North Africa in a mine-clearing incident. Eisenhower broke the news to her, and Kay reflected on the loss of her fiancé. Ours had been a wartime romance. There had been weeks and months when we had not seen each other. It was as if we had met and loved in a vacuum. Now, when I tried to mourn him, I discovered I did not really know the man I was grieving for. Things began to evolve rather quickly in the relationship now between Eisenhower and Kay Summersby. She said that we just sat there one evening and looked at each other. We were both silent, serious, eyes-searching eyes. It was a communion, a pledging, and a vow of love. For over a year, Ike and I had spent more time with each other than anyone else. We had worked, worried, and played together. Love had grown so naturally that it was part of our lives, something precious that I had taken for granted without ever putting a name to it. I love this man. And then, a few days later, Kay reflected on this. God damn it, can't you tell I'm crazy about you? Ike barked at me, she later wrote. It was like an explosion. We were suddenly in each other's arms. His kisses absolutely unraveled me. Hungry, strong, demanding. And I responded every bit as passionately. He stopped, took my face between his hands. God damn it, he said, I love you. So wrote Kay Summersby. Now, there were rumors about Kay and Ike certainly throughout the war. Mamie was concerned. She kept writing letters about this, but a lot of biographers actually disputed the notion that there was an actual affair between Summersby and Eisenhower. No hard evidence. It was unclear whether or not the relationship was ever consummated. Even in Kay's telling, it sounds like there were a couple of attempts at that, but Ike was unable to perform. It was more of an affair of the heart than something physical, but was it accurate at all? Well, one of the most convincing responses on this, to give it credibility, comes from General Omar Bradley. He thought so. He was one of Ike's classmates. He was close to Ike before, during, and after the war. And later on, after Kay wrote her second book, he said this: their close relationship is quite accurately portrayed, Bradley wrote, so far as my personal knowledge extends, in Kay's second book, Past Forgetting. Ike's son John published his father's personal letters to Mamie in part to refute Kay's allegation that she and Ike were deeply in love. Many of these letters are obviously Ike's replies to probing letters from Mamie about his relationship with Kay. To my mind, Ike protests too much, thus defeating John's purpose. Again, he believed that the reflection in Past Forgetting was an accurate portrayal. Other biographers disagree. but there's the record. May 1943, the Americans still pushing for the cross-channel invasion of France, but the British continuing to push back. We can't get to that this year. We're going to have to get to it next year. So where do they go? The spring campaign was going to be in Sicily and then Italy. The goal was to get Mussolini out and get the Italians out of the war, the Italians being the allies of the Germans. Ike was put in charge, again, as supreme commander of this campaign, while also overseeing the planning for the cross-channel invasion, which they called Overlord. That was now due to take place the following year. July 10th of 1943, 175,000 soldiers for the Allies landed across about 200 beaches in southern Sicily. 1,400 ships were involved in this invasion, and Sicily now was pretty strongly defended by 350,000 soldiers, but only 60,000 or so were German soldiers. And once the Americans landed, a lot of the Italians, thousands of the Italians, actually just surrendered on the spot. But Hitler was pouring in reinforcements just like he tried to do in North Africa. He's going to try to maintain the defensive posture in Sicily and protect his allies in Italy. Eisenhower predicted they would have Sicily captured in 2 weeks. It took about 6, in part because on the ground, Monty was pretty slow. Bernard Montgomery, the commander on the ground, the British general, he was supported by U.S. General George Patton, who was sort of protecting Monty's flank, but Monty had the tip of the spear and he wasn't going very far. The Germans and the Italians had the control of some of the high ground, so this was going to be difficult fighting, but Monty was convinced he wanted to go straight north to Messina, which was the tipping point that they wanted to get to, and that was going to be difficult because of the terrain. Patton, who's one of the most aggressive officers, maybe in the history of the U.S. Army, certainly at the time, he had a different idea in mind. He wasn't going to sit there and guard Monty's flank. He took his army and he went west and then north, setting his sights on Palermo. This side of the island was actually relatively lightly guarded, so it wasn't difficult to overtake. But again, what was he doing way out there? Well, then he swung east to go to Messina, and he beat Monty there Monty was about 12 miles away when Patton and his forces entered Messina, and he accepted the surrender of that town. So some of these little petty rivalries across the services sometimes can actually spur great results. Eisenhower was thrilled about this when they finally got the job done, but they had still made a mistake. They had failed to cut off the Strait of Messina, which was the passageway, the water passageway between Italy and Sicily. So about 50,000 Germans and a lot of their tanks and other equipment were allowed to escape through the Straits of Messina, even though they had captured Sicily for now. Now, George Patton was an emotional leader for the United States. He had his highs, he had his lows, and there were reports coming in here in August of 1943 that Patton had visited a couple of hospitals, army hospitals in Sicily, to comfort the wounded and meet with the men. In a couple of cases, he found soldiers, privates, who had no apparent wounds. They were what they were called battle fatigue. And Patton basically lost it. These men aren't wounded. What are they doing here? He slapped them, Privates Charles Kuhl and Paul Bennett, in 2 different locations. Again, he slapped them. With Bennett, he actually pulled out his ivory-handled revolver, threatening to shoot the man before his staff got him out of there. Well, word travels pretty quickly through the channels, and Eisenhower found out about this, and he had to figure out what's he going to do. Patton's one of his best commanders, but this was unacceptable behavior. He was hoping the story would not get out, but eventually reporters did report on it, and he knew he had to do something. So he sent Patton a letter, a formal rebuke. I clearly understand that firm and drastic measures are at times necessary in order to secure the desired objectives, but this does not excuse brutality, abuse of the sick, nor exhibition of uncontrollable temper in front of subordinates. He insisted on apologies from Patton for all the people involved, which Patton did, but he was not going to fire Patton. He was not going to get rid of him. He was simply too valuable. It kind of put him onto the side. He was not going to be involved in the battle in Italy, but Eisenhower was going to preserve Patton for future fights. Back in Sicily, Monty then crossed those streets of Messina. He's going into Italy. General Mark Clark took a different force, landing at Salerno. Mussolini was actually removed from power by the king. But Hitler again sent in reinforcements. Even though an armistice was created officially between Italy and the Allies, Hitler wasn't buying that. It took 9 months before the Americans and the British actually secured Rome, and Rome fell. So it was a long, bloody, costly fight in Italy. But by now, most of the folks were focusing on Overlord, that cross-channel invasion. One of the biggest questions for that was, again, who's going to lead it? But that's the story for another day. That is Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander, Sicily, Italy, and Kay. From the life of Dwight Eisenhower. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.